there are people who worry that if the government issues a digital currency, they will know exactly how people are spending money. Do we want the government to have that much visibility into our economic lives?
Welcome to International Business Today, where we'll discuss the most critical issues in international business through the lens of cutting-edge research. Here at Northeastern University, we are committed to creating and disseminating great research that will help you in your practice. We want to get our research out of the journals and into the hands of those that are making great decisions with it. We want this podcast to be for anyone interested in international business, whether they're students, academics, or practitioners. This podcast is for all global professionals out there. I am so excited about this first episode. My name is Paula Caligiuri. I am a professor at Northeastern University in the mckim School of Business. I can think of no better guest than my first guest, Ravi Sarathy. Ravi is a professor of international business and strategy. Ravi's also the director of the Bachelor of Science of International Business, one of the top-ranked programs in international business today. Ravi is an expert in global strategy, blockchain, implementation of blockchain, and all kinds of great stuff we'll hear about today. So excited. Ravi's latest book from MIT Press, I'm going to read the title for you, is Enterprise Strategy for Blockchain, Lessons in Disruption from FinTech, Supply Chains, and Consumer Industries. Today, Ravi will be sharing some insights about his new book, focusing on blockchain and digital currencies and what this all means for international business. Ravi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Paula. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk about blockchain. It's a topic that's complex and not completely well understood by much of the public, including business executives, academics, and students. So I'm delighted to be able to talk about my research and perhaps explain blockchain to your audience.
I'm so excited about this, and I love the T-shirt. For if you can see it, if you're listening, you can't, but if you can see it, you see that Ravi is wearing a T-shirt that says, "In blockchain we trust." And trust was a really important element of this. I know a lot of this emerged right after the crash in 2008, 2009, when people were really worried about currencies that were centrally controlled. Mm-hmm. But I'm imagining a lot has changed in 12 years. Ravi, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. What happened in 2008, 2009, as you alluded to, was almost near collapse of the global financial system. Among other effects, a group of people began to wonder about the wisdom of relying on governments and national currencies controlled by governments. You might say that this was a libertarian movement, and they felt that it was ripe time to combine three existing technologies, which were peer-to-peer communication, decentralization, encryption. And by combining those three, and also using tokens as incentives, that they could create an alternative to centrally managed currencies. Bitcoin was the first example of blockchain, and there have been many others, Ethereum, for example. But the problem is these currencies are exceedingly volatile. If you think about what money is, money should be a store of value, a means of exchange, and a unit of account. And the problem is when Bitcoin fluctuates as it has between about $70,000 and $20,000 in the space of the last year, people can't really rely on blockchain as a way to save money and store it. It's a speculation rather than an investment, you might say. And so I think what we're looking ahead in the future is what are the ways in which we can take the best of blockchain and digital currencies, which are in fact valuable, but also make it more useful to the public so that it is not as influenced by the volatility.
So, Ravi, it does sound like there's so much volatility that hopefully will be corrected going forward. But may I ask a more basic question? We have Venmo, we have Apple Pay, Google Pay, whatever. Do we really need another tax solution?
I think a very good question at the very heart of why perhaps we need digital currencies. If you think about Venmo connects to your bank. And without a bank, you can't have Venmo. Similarly, if you have a credit card is issued by a bank and another bank manages the credit card with the merchant. And so these two intermediaries take out 2 or 3%. Almost any financial transaction today relies on intermediaries who vouch for the counterparty, who guarantee that that person has enough money in the bank or owns certain property that they are entitled to sell. And so the counterparty trust is a central issue in most of the financial world. So this T-shirt I'm wearing, which says "In blockchain we trust," is actually about the idea that you no longer need intermediaries to guarantee trust. The machine is the engine of trust, if you can believe that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So we're pulling out those institutions, those intermediaries, but it seems like governments are getting back into the game, right? With this new currency that's
right.
government-backed.
As I said earlier, volatility is a problem and makes many merchants and many individuals more wary of blockchain and somewhat reluctant to use blockchain. Now, there have been stable coins, which are private coins issued by companies such as MakerDAO, MaKer, and they have a currency called the DAI, DAI. But the problem is these are controlled by private companies. So there's always a matter of how much can we trust them? Do they have enough reserves to back their private currency? And what happens if there's a loss of confidence? And as we've seen in recent months, there has been runs on these private stablecoins. Terra Luna is an example where the currency dropped from 1-to-1 parity to the dollar to perhaps 10 cents. And so you can't really have digital currencies if you have that kind of volatility. So what's happened is governments around the world have started thinking, why don't we issue a digital dollar, a digital euro, a digital yuan, where we are the ones who issue the digital currency, and most people might agree that the government is trustworthy. At least the U.S. government is trustworthy in the sense of having maintained a dollar for over 200 years. And by maintaining that long-term strength of the dollar, people might say, if there's a digital currency available from a government, I'm willing to trust it and start using that digital currency.
And that's going to be the future, you think, for these digital currencies?
It's not completely certain. I'll tell you why. The phenomenon I'm referring to is called central bank digital currencies, CBDC.
CBDCs, right.
Now, there are people who worry that if the government issues a digital currency, they will know exactly how people are spending money. Because everyone in the digital currency world has to have some kind of an ID, a unique ID with a private key, so that they can authorize a transaction. One of the beauties of blockchain is that you can transact value. Usually when you do the internet, you have a transaction where you say, I'm going to buy this from you, and then you have a separate parallel transaction where you actually pay using your Visa, MasterCard, debit card, or whatever. So in the internet, you can have simultaneous transaction with payment, simultaneous payment versus delivery of whatever is being transacted. So the danger or the fear among certain parties is, do we want the government to have that much visibility into our economic lives? And I think there are enough libertarians and enough politicians who subscribe to less government is better than more, who might be opposed to a U.S. dollar.
Interesting. So let's bring this over to IB practice now. And are you seeing that blockchain is now growing significantly for international business practice and operations?
Yes. If you think of what international business is, it's transacting across borders, which means you have to have cross-border payments, where your currency, the dollar, is exchanged for, let's say, the yuan. You need to trust people long distance without necessarily being able to see them. So you need to know that I can rely on this merchant to ship me 100,000 pairs of shoes after I've ordered them. You need to have the ability to governance. So if you're a multinational with factories and warehouses and retail establishments around the world, you need a way to administer all of those far-flung operations. And then there's a matter of supply chains. That international business relies on supply chains. You need a merchant who ships, you need the container ship, you need the port authorities, you need the customs agencies, you need some way of financing that shipment, letters of credit, for example. And so all of these parties essentially have to cooperate in a supply chain. And today's supply chain is very slow. It's subject to errors, where the information is missing, where the information is fraudulent, where people can try to forge documents, where information is not available on time. And if information is not available on time, the supply chain slows down. You can have shortages, delays in delivery, etc. So blockchain has capabilities which allow it to be used in arenas like supply chain to make them much more efficient, much less costly, much less reliant on paper, and have the information simultaneously available to all parties to a transaction while preserving privacy, so that that information is only available to those parties and to nobody else. And of course, payment can be also done at the same time, so that there's no worries about, will I receive the payment when this ship is docked and the goods are unloaded and the custody goes to the retailer. How do I know I'll receive payment? Blockchain is a great way to make sure that that payment is going to happen simultaneously with the transfer of title.
Wow, what a great way to ensure transparency and trust, as you said, throughout the whole global supply chain process. Do you have examples of how companies are using blockchain?
There are quite a few examples. One is, of course, this idea of cross-border payments. In cross-border payments, you or I, who wants to initiate the transaction, we go to our bank and say we would like to pay $100,000 to party X in another country. My bank has to have a relationship with another bank in that country. Mm-hmm. It could be its own branch, or it could be another independent bank. So these are called correspondent banks. And by the way, the two correspondent banks have to go through some kind of central bank in each country, so that the total amount of money transferred out of the U.S. has to go through the Federal Reserve and then accepted by the equivalent of the Federal Reserve in another country, and then it goes to the correspondent bank, who then has to either have an account of the person with whom you're transacting, or they'll have to find another bank which has the account of that person. And so the whole chain takes longer. And because of multiple steps, each step on the way adds a fee.
I was just going to say, we've all paid those fees,
exactly.
Right?
We've all paid those fees. And confirmation takes time. You don't know when the transaction is actually completed. So it might take 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. So all of these delays, uncertainty about completion, and high fees make cross-border payments an incredibly cumbersome approach. And so currently we use something called SWIFT, which is a technology invented in the, I think, 1960s probably. And it's essentially messaging between banks. And until the message is received, the transaction cannot proceed to the next step. And if the message is incomplete or distorted or missing certain pieces of information, the transaction is rejected. So what blockchain, Ripple, which is the company I'm thinking of, Ripple is a company that's trying to make cross-border payments very simple using a digital currency. So they have created a currency called XRP. And so I can buy XRP from Ripple, use the Ripple network to send the money, and they can instantaneously, literally within seconds, transfer that ownership of XRP, which is the digital currency, from me to the other party. And then that other party can go ahead and convert the XRP into local currencies. Wow. So Ripple, of course, makes money from running the network and owning XRP, because you have to buy XRP in order to be able to use their network. And so XRP and Ripple are an interesting example of how you can use blockchain to do cross-border payments. Now, of course, my question would be, when and if a government issues a CBDC, will a bank or an individual want to use XRP as opposed to using the official digital yuan, etc.? And what's fascinating is China is one of the countries that's very advanced in blockchain. At the Olympics, the Winter Olympics this year, 2022, January, they issued about 250 million apps. In other words, 250 million people in China, Chinese citizens, downloaded an app which allowed them to transact digitally with the Chinese currency. So the Chinese yuan could be transacted digitally within China among the Chinese. And a few people who went to the Olympics, journalists and athletes, were given some allocation of yuan to use in China while they were there on their smartphones. Once the digital yuan is well established in China as a means of exchange, then China can start trying to convince other nations to use it also. Because China, for example, has what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially the old Silk Road, but what they've tried to do is replicate it, connecting China to many other countries. And once China lends a country money to build a road or build a dock or build an airport, then they can tell them, we're going to send you the money in digital yuan, and you can pay us back in digital yuan. So China can gradually get other countries to sign on to a global system using the yuan. And this has some people worried about, will Chinese control of the global system increase and concomitantly reduce the role of the US dollar or the euro or some other currency. Sure. And I think that's also a matter of national interest. It's no longer just commercial interest, but also what does the US gain or lose from no longer being the dominant currency in the world? So there are some interesting political questions which have to be resolved through legislation in order to develop this new regime further. But if I'm a company today,
that was going to be my next question, right? So the CBDCs really seem like an exciting new area, and for all the reasons you mentioned, both political as well as commercial, we need to be exploring those. But if I was listening as a business practitioner today and I said, okay, I want to give this a try for my own organization, where would you take them? What would you recommend?
I think the first step is to experiment.
Okay.
What
does that mean then?
Okay. You have to set up digital payments where you say, I'm going to accept the following digital currencies. Bitcoin perhaps, Ether perhaps, and the CBDC if it is available. And most important, I have to create the network so that it's secure and can authorize the transactions and safeguard the customer information so that I gain control and primacy over the customer interaction. Right now, if you think about what's happening with payments, let's say I use Visa. Visa pays me someday, a day, 3 days, 5 days later. But in the meantime, Visa has all of the information about what is actually happening. Right. Now, I'm not saying that they're able to use that individualized information, but they do have information in the aggregate. And if they wanted to get into digital currencies, then they could be the one controlling that channel. Now, here's the interesting thing. If the US politicians come to the conclusion that we do not wish the US government to be involved and directly issue a digital dollar so that you and I will open accounts, open accounts with the Federal Reserve and get allocations of digital dollars based on how much money we want to transfer from our accounts. So we have digital dollar accounts with the Federal Reserve. And if that is not possible for political reasons and privacy reasons, what the Federal Reserve might do is create relationships with some of the major financial organizations, such as, say, JP Morgan. And those would be the ones that would issue you and me digital currencies. And they, in turn, would deposit money with the Federal Reserve and get allocations of digital dollars. So the Federal Reserve would only interact directly with a dozen or a couple of dozen of the most prominent financial institutions in the country, and you and I would then interact more with those banks and financial entities. Wow. So we might see that happening in the US, but not necessarily in other countries.
Wow, how interesting about where this is all going to go, right? And I guess that's you're so knowledgeable in this area and such an expert in this field, Ravi. I would love to know if you looked in the crystal ball right now and saw to the future of Bitcoin and CBDCs, digital currency. Where do you think this is all going?
Well, I think digital currencies are here to stay. And I think we'll have a world of coexistence where you will have a number of official digital currencies coexisting with several private stablecoins, as well as, to some extent, Ethereum, Ether, and the Bitcoin. The reason why I think Bitcoin and Ether are so attractive is, first of all, legacy. They've been around since 2010, Bitcoin, and about 2012-13 for Ethereum. So there are many, many people out there who own significant amounts of Bitcoin and Ether and are accustomed to using those networks, Bitcoin networks and Ethereum networks, for peer-to-peer direct transactions. So they may say, it's worked for me, and so I'm going to continue to use it. Or they might, like you and I have 5 different credit cards in our wallets, so they might say, I'll do some transactions in Bitcoin, some in Ethereum, some in some synthetic coin issued by JP Morgan, and some in the official digital dollar or digital euro, etc. So I think we'll see that world happening. The other thing is, and I think this is actually very exciting, there's about 40% of the world that is unbanked. They have no bank accounts, they have no credit cards, and so they have to rely on cash. which can be stolen. They can't save money and receive interest. They can't show a credit history and be eligible to receive loans so that they can buy goods on credit or buy a house someday on as a mortgage on credit. So I think having a digital currency could make it very possible for citizens to directly have an account with the official country entity and receive digital dollars, which is safe and secure, and then build up some kind of relationship with the financial system, which then allows them to do loans and investments and savings, as well as very securely manage their money. They could start getting financial planning advice, perhaps even from nonprofits. So I think financial inclusion is likely to be one of the great benefits of moving to a digital currency world, particularly if some of the digital currency transactions can be done offline. Because remember, we are assuming that the internet is continuously available to everyone. But there are ways in which you can have digital currency transactions done offline and then updated once you get back online. And that's a new world that is beginning to happen in a number of pilots. And that's why I say pilots are very important, experimentation.
Yeah, I do want to talk a little bit more about that before we close out with you, Ravi. It's just, I'm imagining being that international business practitioner listening to this and saying, you know what, I want to jump in. I understand this idea about experimentation or pilots. What would be a great example from an organization of a pilot study or an experiment that they've done with?
Okay. Deutsche Bank was very interested in the idea of how can we use blockchain for bonds. The way bonds work, a company comes to Deutsche Bank, or Deutsche Bank works with its clients, and the company says, I need to probably borrow $100 million for the next 5 years. For whatever purpose. And Deutsche Bank traditionally would have said, okay, we will do the due diligence, and once we are convinced that you are a good client who should be able to borrow $100 million from the financial markets at a certain interest rate based on your risk profile, etc., we will then go to our affiliates or people who are in our financial world and say, how much of this 100 million would you be able to sell to your clients? So you form a syndicate. And then once the syndicate is formed, you officially write up the bond, have lawyers involved, covenants and collateral and so on, and then issue the bond, and then collect the payments from the company and issue it as dividends every 3 months, and at the end of 5 years, close the bond by receiving the money back and paying the principal out. Right? So that's a traditional system. What if you could put the bond entirely on a blockchain so that instead of having 30 different syndicate members involved, you could have all of the clients who want to buy the bond qualified first, financially qualified, and then join the blockchain, buy the bond, have the registry maintained on the blockchain, and automatically receive payments. If there is a sale made so that the title gets transferred, it gets registered on the blockchain, and so forth. Okay, so Deutsche Bank has done pilots in this arena, and what they've discovered is the pilot works great. What they now need to do is convince all of the third parties outside of Deutsche Bank to join them so that they can together create a world in which you can have bonds on a blockchain. And by the way, Deutsche Bank is not the only one. The World Bank worked with Australia to issue bonds on a blockchain not too long ago, and there are a number of such instances over in Europe, in China, I'm sure, and elsewhere. So the world is beginning to move in this direction. It's not mainstream as yet, but I think as these pilots gather movement, and as they become more and more acceptable, the results are satisfactory, I think there'll be imitation. Somebody will say, oh, Deutsche Bank was successful, so maybe I should try that too. And I think that's going to be a very powerful force for making blockchain more mainstream.
Yeah, and it's the Deutsche Bank example was such a terrific one. And I know in your book you have lots of other examples, so a great place to start, and we'll put it in the show notes, a great place to start is to get a copy of your book, read about some of these wonderful organizations that are diving into it. So Ravi, you spoke about digital currencies as they related to institutions, as they related to governments, but what about smaller organizations, retailers, whatever? Are they getting into the game?
Yeah, I think consumer products certainly can use blockchain. There's a company out, I think in California, Decor Matters, which is a company that works with retail clients in the field of interior decoration. And so the idea is people buy a new flat, an apartment, a house, and they want the services of a professional designer to help them buy furniture and make the house look the way their design style, but helped and influenced by someone who they respect. And decor matters. And of course, the issue here is the intellectual property. That if I'm an interior decorator and I've been asked to consult with you, I draw up plans for you, I tell you, give you some good ideas, and then you might go off and try to use my ideas without paying me for it. And so Decor Matters is a company that uses the blockchain to link independent decorators with consumers who want to decorate their houses and apartments. And because it's in the blockchain, there's no question about the flow of information. You know exactly when a certain design was provided, who provided it, there's a timestamp, and so it's very clear about the intellectual property being used. But what Decor Matters also does is, by putting together the consumer with the interior decorator can get a fee, and then it also makes it possible for the consumer to buy lamps and couches and mirrors and any kind of accessories they want to make that decoration come through, that decoration suggestion come through. And they, of course, will link to the suppliers and get a commission. And so they also act like a platform for people to buy house goods and accessories. And so that's one example of a company that's using blockchain. And then, of course, there's NBA Top Shot. I don't know if you've heard of the NBA Top Shot. You might not think of the NBA as hugely innovative. But what happened was during the pandemic, all the arenas shut down. So the NBA was trying to figure out how to maintain fan engagement and how to capitalize on the brand that each team has and each player has. And so they came up with the idea of using blockchain to make one-of-a-kind videos called NFTs, right? Non-fungible tokens. Right. And they said, what we'll do is we'll, of course, shoot the whole game, but then we'll pick segments from the game where, for example, LeBron might have made an incredible shot that helped win the game, particularly during a championship or in a close rival game where one team might be, the league leader. And then we will make these available for sale on a marketplace. And all of a sudden, fans could start buying videos of their favorite players. Now, you might say, isn't that silly? I could always just go to YouTube and see the video or clip it and keep it. But the point is the NFT gives you a kind of guarantee that this is unique and this is one of a kind, and you can sell it. And some of these NFTs of Top Shot moments have appreciated enormously in value. Wow. So using blockchain has allowed the NBA to not only create a new source of revenue, which is shared with the players, of course, but also to maintain the connection with the fans at a time when physical attendance at a game was almost impossible.
It's so exciting. I mean, the opportunities really are limitless for different organizations. And I am 100% certain we're going to need to get you back on a future episode to talk about even more of this. There's just so much to unbundle here in the future. It sounds like it's going to be changing very rapidly. And again, I just love the T-shirt and Blockchain We Trust. So much fun. But I do have one final question for you, Ravi. Your portfolio, do you own any of these digital currencies?
No, I have not purchased Bitcoin or Ethereum or some of the other cryptocurrencies out there. And the reason is quite straightforward. If you look at these currencies, they're highly volatile. And if you look at the volatility in the last year, it's highly correlated with the S&P 500, with NASDAQ, and so forth. So to me, buying Bitcoin or Ether, unless you're going to use it in transactions which are immediately decided, so that you only own it for a few seconds, unless you're doing that, you're speculating, and then you ask, what are the other ways in which I can speculate? Most portfolio managers will tell you, based on your risk profile and age and total assets available, that you can invest some portion of your assets, 5%, 10%, in highly speculative investments. So there are commodities you can buy, such as oil futures. You can invest in very high-tech stocks, biotech stocks, for example, which might take 10 or 15 years to reach profitability. And so, sure, you can invest in Bitcoin and Ether if it fits your risk profile and if you're sympathetic to the idea of promoting digital currencies. But I personally, while I find blockchain very fascinating, I'm more interested in how blockchain can be used by enterprises in their businesses and less so in the pure idea of blockchain underlying cryptocurrencies.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back for a future episode, Ravi. Again, thank you so much for all of your insight. I learned a lot. I know our listeners and viewers also learned a lot. So thank you for being our first guest on International Business Today.
I'm honored to be the first guest, Paula, and I'll be delighted to come back whenever you want me.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
To our listeners, thank you so much for being part of our first episode of International Business Today. It was a great episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it, like it, tell your friends. We want to hear more about what you would like to hear from, what topics are interesting for you, what can we share based on our research. Again, we are committed to cutting-edge research in the field of international business and strategy, and we want to make your practice even better through that. My name is Paula Caligiuri. I am so happy to be a part of International Business Today. Thank you for listening.